Sometime around 1200 before the Common Era, the most advanced civilization the world had ever known came to an end. Not one kingdom fell, not one city burned. An entire network of interconnected civilizations, stretching from the shores of Greece to the banks of the Nile, from the mountains of Anatolia to the island of Cyprus, from the great trading ports of the Levantine coast to the palace complexes of Crete, collapsed within a span of roughly 50 years, plunging the eastern Mediterranean into a dark age that would last for centuries. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed and never rebuilt. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for more than 4 centuries and had fought the Egyptian pharaohs to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, vanished so completely that its very existence was forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century. The great trading city of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria was burned to the ground and abandoned, its last letter found still in the kiln where it was being fired, a desperate plea for help against an approaching enemy fleet. The city of Troy, whatever its connection to the Homeric legends, was destroyed in a conflagration that left a layer of ash and rubble across the archaeological record. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Aegean to the Euphrates, civilization did not merely decline, it shattered. And at the center of this catastrophe, mentioned in the inscriptions of the only great power that survived the collapse, was a force that the ancient Egyptians called simply the peoples of the sea. The Sea Peoples. The name conjures images of vast armadas, of warrior fleets descending on the coasts of the civilized world, of raiders and destroyers who swept away empires that had endured for centuries. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III, who fought 2 major battles against the Sea Peoples in approximately 1178 and 1175 before the Common Era, left detailed inscriptions and relief carvings at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in western Thebes, describing the invaders as a coalition of peoples who came from the islands and the mainlands of the sea, who destroyed everything in their path, and who were turned back only by the might of Egypt. The inscriptions name specific groups within the coalition: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, and others, names that scholars have spent more than a century trying to connect to known peoples and places, with results that remain frustratingly inconclusive. Who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? What drove them to attack the most powerful civilizations in the world? And were they truly the cause of the Bronze Age collapse? Or were they merely one symptom of a catastrophe that had deeper and more complex roots? These are among the most debated questions in all of ancient history. The Bronze Age collapse, the destruction of the palace civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 before the Common Era, is one of the most dramatic and most consequential events in the history of the ancient world. An event that ended an era of unprecedented international trade, diplomatic exchange, and cultural interconnection, and that ushered in centuries of fragmentation, depopulation, and cultural regression from which the Mediterranean world would not fully recover until the rise of classical Greece some 500 years later. The collapse destroyed civilizations that had produced some of the greatest achievements of the ancient world: the Linear B script of the Mycenaeans, the cuneiform archives of the Hittites, the alphabetic writing of Ugarit, the monumental architecture of the Egyptian New Kingdom. It severed trade routes that had connected the eastern Mediterranean to the tin mines of Afghanistan, the copper deposits of Cyprus, the cedar forests of Lebanon, and the gold mines of Nubia. It erased entire peoples from the historical record and created a void in the archaeological evidence that scholars call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of roughly 3 centuries from which almost no written records survive. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what we know about the Sea Peoples, what we do not know, and why the mystery of their identity and their role in the Bronze Age collapse remains one of the great unsolved problems of ancient history. You are going to learn about the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, a world of great kings who addressed each other as brothers, who exchanged gifts of gold and lapis lazuli, who married each other's daughters, and who maintained a system of international relations that was, in many ways, more sophisticated than anything that would exist in the Mediterranean for the next 3,000 years. You are going to see how that world fell apart, and you are going to confront the possibility that the destruction was not the work of a single enemy, but the result of a cascade of failures, environmental, economic, political, and military, that interacted with and amplified each other until the entire system collapsed under its own weight. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story of the Sea Peoples is not merely a story about ancient warfare. It is a story about the fragility of complex systems, about how a world that seems stable, prosperous, and permanent can disintegrate with a speed and a completeness that leaves future generations struggling to understand what happened and why. The Late Bronze Age world was, by the standards of its time, a global civilization, a network of interconnected kingdoms that depended on each other for trade, for raw materials, for diplomatic support, and for the maintenance of the international order that sustained them all. When that network failed, no single kingdom could survive on its own, and the result was a collapse that was greater than the sum of its parts, a catastrophe that destroyed not just individual kingdoms but the entire system of international relations that had connected them. Now, let's begin. To understand the Sea Peoples and the collapse they are associated with, we must first understand the world they destroyed, because the world of the Late Bronze Age was one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient civilization, a system of interconnected kingdoms and empires that maintained a level of international cooperation, trade, and cultural exchange that would not be matched in the Mediterranean for more than a millennium after its destruction. The Late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 before the Common Era, was dominated by a small number of great powers that controlled the eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. In Egypt, the New Kingdom pharaohs, the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, ruled one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the ancient world, controlling the Nile Valley from the Delta to Nubia and projecting military and diplomatic influence across the Levant and into the heart of the Near East. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, centered on its capital at Hattusa in the highlands of central Turkey, controlled a vast territory stretching from the Aegean coast to the borders of Mesopotamia, rivaling Egypt in military power and diplomatic prestige. In Mesopotamia, the Kassite dynasty ruled Babylon, maintaining the ancient Mesopotamian tradition of urban civilization and serving as a crucial node in the international trade networks that connect the Mediterranean to the resources of the Iranian Plateau and Central Asia. In northern Mesopotamia, the Kingdom of Assyria was beginning its long rise to power, though in the Late Bronze Age it was still a secondary player in the international system. And in the Aegean, the Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece and Crete controlled a network of palace-centered kingdoms that produced the earliest form of written Greek, engaged in long-distance trade across the Mediterranean, and built the massive fortified palaces Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, whose ruins would inspire the legends of the heroic age in later Greek mythology. Between these great powers existed a constellation of smaller but strategically important kingdoms and city-states that played essential roles in the functioning of the international system. The Kingdom of Mitanni, in northern Mesopotamia, was a major power in the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era, controlling the upper Euphrates region and serving as a buffer between Egypt, Hatti, and Assyria, before being absorbed by the expanding Hittite and Assyrian empires. The Kingdom of Al-Ashir, identified with the island of Cyprus, was the primary source of copper for the entire eastern Mediterranean, and its rulers corresponded with the pharaohs on terms of near equality, reflecting the economic importance of the copper trade to the Late Bronze Age system. The city-states of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and others, served as the commercial intermediaries of the ancient world, facilitating the exchange of goods between the great powers and maintaining the maritime trade routes that connected the eastern Mediterranean to the wider world. These city-states were politically subordinate to the great powers, alternately vassal to Egypt or to Hatti, but they were economically indispensable, and their destruction in the collapse had consequences that reverberated across the entire system. These great powers did not exist in isolation. They were connected by a dense network of trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and cultural exchanges that made the Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean one of the most interconnected regions in the ancient world. The evidence for this interconnection comes from multiple sources, but the most vivid and most detailed evidence comes from two extraordinary archives of diplomatic correspondence that have survived in the archaeological record. The first is the Amarna Letters, a collection of approximately 350 clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age, found at the site of Amarna in Middle Egypt, the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled in the mid-14th century before the Common Era. The Amarna letters contain correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and the kings of the other great powers, Babylon, Hatti, Mitanni, Assyria, Azawa, and Alashia, as well as letters from the vassal rulers of the Levantine city-states, who were subject to Egyptian authority. The letters reveal a world of intense diplomatic activity, in which the great kings addressed each other as brothers, exchanged elaborate gifts of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, textiles, and other luxury goods, negotiated dynastic marriages, mediated disputes, and maintained a system of international relations that was governed by recognized norms of protocol, reciprocity, and mutual obligation. The language of the Amarna letters is revealing in its intimacy and its directness. The great kings call each other "my brother," a term that signifies diplomatic equality and mutual respect, and they write with a frankness that would be remarkable in any period of diplomatic history. The king of Babylon writes to the pharaoh complaining that the gold sent as a gift is not of the quality promised, that when his servants melted it down, they found the quantity insufficient, and that this is unacceptable between brothers. The king of Mitanni requests that the pharaoh send him gold, because in Egypt gold is as abundant as dirt, a phrase that reveals both the legendary wealth of Egypt and the frank, sometimes abrasive tone of Late Bronze Age diplomacy. The vassal rulers of the Levantine city-states write to the pharaoh with a very different tone, one of deference and supplication, requesting military assistance against their rivals, protesting their loyalty, and complaining about the aggression of neighbouring rulers. The letters from the vassal rulers reveal a Levantine coast that was politically fragmented and perpetually contested, with the city-states manoeuvring for advantage within the framework of Egyptian overlordship, a dynamic that would have important consequences when that framework collapsed. The Amarna letters also reveal the importance of dynastic marriage in the maintenance of the international system. The great kings regularly negotiated marriages between their royal families, sending their daughters to the courts of their allies as a means of cementing diplomatic bonds and creating ties of kinship between the ruling houses. The negotiations surrounding these marriages, documented in detail in the Amarna correspondence, reveal the complexity and the delicacy of Late Bronze Age diplomacy, with the kings bargaining over the size of the dowry, the rank and the beauty of the bride, the timing of the wedding, and the diplomatic protocols that would govern the relationship between the two courts. The dynastic marriages created a web of kinship ties that linked the ruling families of the great powers, a web that reinforced the diplomatic bonds of the international system, and that made the great powers, in a very real sense, members of a single extended family. The language of the Amarna letters is revealing in its intimacy. The great kings call each other "my brother," a term that signifies diplomatic equality and mutual respect. They complain when gifts are perceived as insufficient. They express displeasure when diplomatic requests are ignored, and they make demands that would not be out of place in a modern diplomatic exchange. The king of Babylon writes to the pharaoh complaining that the gold sent as a gift is not of the quality promised, that when his servants melted it down, they found it to be less than 2 minas in weight, and that this is unacceptable between brothers. The king of Mitanni requests that the pharaoh send him gold, because in Egypt gold is as abundant as dirt, a phrase that reveals both the legendary wealth of Egypt and the frank, sometimes abrasive tone of Late Bronze Age diplomacy. The letters are a window into a world of sophisticated international relations, a world in which the great powers maintained a balance of power through a combination of military deterrence, diplomatic negotiation, dynastic marriage, and reciprocal gift exchange, a system that bore a striking resemblance to the balance of power systems of modern European diplomacy. The second archive is the cuneiform tablets found at Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, which contain not only diplomatic correspondence but also treaties, legal texts, religious documents, and administrative records that provide a detailed picture of the Hittite state and its relations with the other great powers. The Hittite archives include the text of the famous treaty between Hattusili III and Rameses II, concluded after the Battle of Kadesh in approximately 1259 before the Common Era, a treaty that established a formal alliance between the two great powers, and that is the earliest known international peace treaty to have survived in two versions, one Egyptian and one Hittite. The treaty contains provisions for mutual defense, for the extradition of fugitives, for the protection of royal succession, and for the maintenance of peaceful relations between the two kingdoms, provisions that demonstrate the sophistication and the formality of late Bronze Age diplomacy. The Battle of Kadesh itself, fought around 1274, before the Common Era between the forces of Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, was one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history, with both sides fielding thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of infantry on the banks of the Orontes River in modern Syria. The battle was indecisive, with both sides claiming victory, and its ultimate significance lay not in its military outcome, but in the diplomatic settlement that followed, the treaty that ended the conflict and that established a framework of peaceful coexistence between Egypt and Hatti that lasted until the Hittite Empire's destruction in the collapse. The fact that two great powers could fight a massive battle, negotiate a peace treaty, and maintain that peace for more than 70 years demonstrates the maturity and the stability of the late Bronze Age international system, a system that had evolved mechanisms for managing conflict that were remarkably effective, until the system itself collapsed. The Battle of Kadesh is also significant for what it reveals about the military technology and the organizational capacity of the late Bronze Age kingdoms. Both Egypt and Hatti were able to mobilize enormous armies, numbering in the tens of thousands, equip them with bronze weapons and armor, organize them into specialized units, including chariot forces, infantry, and support troops, and project them hundreds of kilometers from their home territories to engage in battle on foreign soil. The logistical demands of such an operation, the production and stockpiling of weapons and armor, the procurement and distribution of food and water for thousands of men and horses, the coordination of multiple military units operating across a wide area were enormous, and their fulfillment demonstrates the administrative capacity and the economic resources of the palace economies that made them possible. The military sophistication of the late Bronze Age kingdoms is one of the reasons why the idea that they could have been overwhelmed by a coalition of tribal or semi-tribal peoples, the Sea Peoples, has seemed implausible to many scholars. The diplomatic relationship between Egypt and Hatti after Kadesh was sealed by a dynastic marriage, in which a Hittite princess was sent to Egypt to become one of the wives of Ramesses II, an event that was celebrated in inscriptions at the Egyptian temple of Abu Simbel, and that symbolized the close and cooperative relationship between the two great powers. The dynastic marriage was not merely a symbolic gesture. It was a political bond that linked the two royal families and that obligated each to defend the other against external threats. The correspondence between the Egyptian and Hittite courts in the decades following the marriage reveals a relationship of genuine warmth and cooperation, with the queens of the two kingdoms exchanging letters and gifts, and the kings coordinating their responses to shared threats. The depth and the intimacy of this relationship make the collapse of the Hittite Empire all the more shocking, because it demonstrates that even the closest diplomatic relationships, even bonds of kinship between ruling families, could not protect the system from the catastrophe that overtook it. The kingdom of Al-Ashir, identified with the island of Cyprus, played a particularly important role in the late Bronze Age economy, as the primary source of copper for the entire eastern Mediterranean. The copper mines of Cyprus, particularly the mines in the Troodos Mountains, produced vast quantities of the metal that was the foundation of Bronze Age technology. The Alashian copper trade was so important that the rulers of Alashia corresponded with the pharaohs on terms of near equality, despite the relatively small size of the island kingdom, a testament to the economic leverage that control of a strategic resource could provide. The disruption of the Cypriot copper trade in the period of the collapse would have had devastating consequences for every kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean that depended on Cypriot copper for the production of bronze. The trade networks of the Late Bronze Age were as impressive as the diplomatic ones. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks, most notably the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the southern coast of Turkey in 1982 and dated to approximately 1300 before the Common Era, has revealed the extraordinary range and diversity of Late Bronze Age maritime trade. The Uluburun ship was carrying a cargo that included 10 tons of Cypriot copper in the form of distinctive oxhide ingots, 1 ton of tin probably from Afghanistan, ebony wood from tropical Africa, glass ingots from Egypt or Mesopotamia, ivory from hippopotami and elephants, Canaanite amphorae containing resin, gold jewelry, scarabs, cylinder seals, and a host of other luxury goods, drawn from every corner of the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The ship was a floating microcosm of the Late Bronze Age trading world, a material demonstration of the interdependence that connected the great powers and the smaller kingdoms and city-states that existed in their orbit. The excavation of the Uluburun wreck, conducted by the underwater archaeologist George Bass and his team from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M University, was one of the most important underwater archaeological projects of the 20th century. The excavation, which took 11 seasons of diving between 1984 and 1994, recovered more than 18,000 artifacts from the sea floor, including the largest collection of Late Bronze Age trade goods ever found in a single context. The cargo included goods from at least 7 different cultures: Egyptian, Canaanite, Mycenaean, Cypriot, Kassite Babylonian, Nubian, and Baltic, evidence of a trade network that stretched from the amber-producing regions of the Baltic Sea to the gold mines of Nubia, from the tin deposits of Central Asia to the copper mines of Cyprus. The Uluburun wreck also contained personal items belonging to the crew or passengers of the ship, including a gold scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, Mycenaean swords and daggers, Canaanite jewelry, and a wooden writing tablet, a diptych with wax surfaces on which messages could be inscribed and erased. That is the oldest known example of this type of writing instrument. The diversity of the personal items suggests that the ship's crew included individuals from multiple cultural backgrounds, a multinational team that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Late Bronze Age maritime trade. The Uluburun wreck is not merely an archaeological find. It is a microcosm of the Late Bronze Age world, a single moment frozen in time that captures the extraordinary range, diversity, and sophistication of the international trading system that the collapse would destroy. The diversity of the cargo demonstrates that Late Bronze Age trade was not limited to exchanges between neighboring states, but involved long-distance connections that linked the entire ancient world in a web of commercial interdependence. The scale and the sophistication of the Late Bronze Age trading system can also be measured by the standardization of the trade goods themselves. The copper ingots found on the Uluburun wreck and at sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean conform to a distinctive shape, the so-called oxhide ingot, a flat, roughly rectangular slab of copper with projecting handles at each corner that facilitated handling and transport. The oxhide ingot was the standard unit of the copper trade throughout the Late Bronze Age eastern Mediterranean, and its consistent shape and weight across sites separated by thousands of kilometers demonstrates the existence of recognized standards and conventions that governed international trade, standards that were understood and accepted by producers, transporters, and consumers across the entire trading network. The existence of trade standards implies the existence of institutions and practices that maintained those standards. mechanisms for quality control, for dispute resolution, and for the enforcement of contractual obligations that the archaeological record can only hint at, but that must have existed for the system to function as effectively as it did. The gift exchange system that connected the great kings was not merely a matter of diplomatic courtesy. It was an essential mechanism for the distribution of luxury goods and strategic materials across the late Bronze Age world, a mechanism that supplemented the commercial trade networks, and that ensured that the rulers of each kingdom had access to the exotic materials that they needed to maintain their prestige, their political authority, and their religious legitimacy. The gifts exchanged between the great kings were not trivial tokens of goodwill. They were substantial quantities of valuable materials: gold, silver, lapis lazuli, ebony, ivory, chariots, textiles, and precious objects of every kind, and the exchange was governed by strict norms of reciprocity that obliged each ruler to respond to a gift with a gift of comparable value. The failure to reciprocate adequately was a diplomatic insult that could strain or rupture the relationship between the great powers, and the Amarna letters contain numerous complaints from kings who felt that their gifts had not been adequately reciprocated. The gift exchange system also served a critical function in the distribution of strategic materials, particularly metals. The great kings routinely requested specific materials from each other, and the fulfillment of these requests was understood as an obligation of the diplomatic relationship. The Egyptian pharaoh sent gold to Babylon, to Hatti, and to Mitanni, and in return received materials that were scarce in Egypt, including tin, lapis lazuli, and fine horses. The Hittite king sent textiles and metals to Egypt, and in return received grain, gold, and diplomatic recognition. The system was, in effect, a reciprocal exchange network that operated alongside the commercial trade routes, providing an additional channel for the distribution of goods and materials that the great powers needed and that they could obtain only from each other. The disruption of this diplomatic exchange network, whether by the collapse of one of the participating powers or by the breakdown of the diplomatic norms that governed the exchange, would have had consequences as severe as the disruption of the commercial trade routes, because it would have deprived the great powers of materials that they depended on the diplomatic system to provide. The Cape Gelidonia wreck, discovered in 1960 and dated to approximately 1200 before the Common Era, the very period of the collapse, contained a similar cargo of copper ingots, tin, bronze tools, and other trade goods, confirming that maritime trade in the Eastern Mediterranean was a large-scale, organized, and ongoing enterprise that connected producers and consumers across thousands of kilometers of sea. The copper trade was particularly important because copper, alloyed with tin to produce bronze, was the essential material of the age used for weapons, tools, armor, vessels, and ornamental objects. The island of Cyprus, known in antiquity as Alaschia, was the primary source of copper in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Cypriot copper trade was one of the pillars of the late Bronze Age economy, connecting the mines of Cyprus to the workshops and armories of Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, and the Levantine city-states. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece deserves particular attention in any account of the late Bronze Age world because it was one of the most dramatically affected victims of the collapse, and because its fall initiated the Greek Dark Ages, one of the most profound cultural regressions in European history. The Mycenaean palaces were not merely royal residences. They were the administrative, economic, and religious centers of highly centralized palace economies that controlled virtually every aspect of economic life within their territories. The Linear B tablets, clay documents inscribed in the earliest known form of the Greek language, reveal a system of bureaucratic administration that tracked the production, storage, and distribution of agricultural products, textiles, metals, and other goods, with a precision that reflects the palace's total control over the economic resources of its territory. The palace at Pylos, the best preserved and most thoroughly excavated of the Mycenaean palace complexes, provides a vivid picture of this administrative system. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record the allocation of land to individual cultivators, the assessment and collection of taxes in the form of agricultural products and livestock, the distribution of rations to workers and dependents, the assignment of craftsmen to to specific tasks and the mobilization of military forces for specific campaigns. The palace was the center of a command economy, in which the state controlled the production and distribution of essential goods, and in which individual economic activity was subordinated to the needs and the directives of the palace administration. The efficiency of this system was remarkable, but its rigidity was a vulnerability, because it left no room for the kind of decentralized, market-driven adaptation that might have allowed the economy to respond flexibly to the shocks of the late 13th and early 12th centuries. The fortification of the Mycenaean citadels in the late 13th century, before the Common Era, is itself evidence that the Mycenaean rulers were aware of increasing threats and were taking measures to defend against them. At Mycenae, the Cyclopean walls that surround the citadel were strengthened and extended during this period, and a secret underground passage was constructed to provide access to a water supply outside the walls in the event of a siege. At Tiryns, similar fortification works were undertaken, including the construction of massive stone galleries within the walls that may have served as storage facilities for food and weapons. The simultaneous fortification of multiple Mycenaean citadels suggests a widespread sense of insecurity, a recognition by the Mycenaean rulers that the old order was under threat and that defensive measures were necessary. The Mycenaean civilization was also connected to the broader Late Bronze Age world through a vigorous trade in fine pottery, perfumed oil, and other luxury goods. Distinctive Mycenaean pottery, with its painted decoration and standardized forms, has been found at sites from Egypt to the Levant to Anatolia, evidence of an export trade managed by the palace administration. The disruption of these trade networks would have deprived the palaces of essential imports while eliminating the markets for their exports. If the trade routes were disrupted, the kingdoms that depended on imported materials would be deprived of the resources they needed to maintain their economies, their military forces, and their political stability. If one great power collapsed, the diplomatic balance that maintained peace and order across the region would be upset, creating opportunities for aggression, rebellion, and the breakdown of the international norms that governed relations between states. The system was, in modern terms, a complex adaptive system, a network of interdependent components that was capable of remarkable resilience under normal conditions, but that was vulnerable to cascading failure when subjected to multiple simultaneous stresses. The evidence for the sophistication and the vulnerability of the Late Bronze Age international system is overwhelming. The system was a remarkable achievement of human organization, a network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that connected dozens of kingdoms and city-states across an area stretching from the Aegean to the Persian Gulf, from the Nile to the Danube. The system produced unprecedented prosperity, unprecedented cultural exchange, and unprecedented international cooperation. The textile trade, the metal trade, the luxury goods trade, the diplomatic gift exchanges, the dynastic marriages, the mutual defense treaties, all of these were elements of a system that was more sophisticated, more extensive, and more interconnected than anything that had existed before in human history. The great powers of the Late Bronze Age had created, through centuries of diplomatic negotiation, commercial exchange, and cultural interaction, a system that was greater than any of its individual parts, a system that enhanced the wealth, the security, and the cultural life of every kingdom that participated in it. And the system was destroyed, within the span of roughly 50 years, by a convergence of crises that overwhelmed its resilience and that exposed the vulnerability that was the hidden cost of its interconnection. The very features that had made the system strong, its interconnectedness, its interdependence, its complexity, were the features that made it fragile, because they ensured that the failure of any one part of the system would propagate through the entire network, amplifying the damage and making recovery impossible. Then something happened that changed everything. The core problem of the Bronze Age collapse is not identifying the Sea Peoples. It is explaining why an entire civilization, a network of interconnected kingdoms that had endured for centuries, and that had survived numerous crises, wars, famines, and natural disasters in the past, collapsed so completely and so rapidly in the decades around 1200 before the Common Era. The Sea Peoples are part of the answer, but they are not the whole answer, and the scholarly debate about the collapse has increasingly focused on the interaction between multiple factors, environmental, economic, political, and military, that converged during this period to produce a catastrophe that no single factor could have produced alone. The environmental dimension of the collapse has received increasing attention in recent years as paleoclimatic research has revealed evidence of significant climate change in the eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era. Studies of pollen cores, lake sediments, and tree ring records from the region have identified a period of prolonged drought that coincided with the period of the collapse, a drought that would have reduced agricultural productivity, depleted water supplies, and put enormous pressure on populations that were already operating at the limits of their food production capacity. The drought has been linked to broader climatic shifts in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, shifts that may have been triggered by changes in ocean circulation patterns or by volcanic activity, and that affected not just the eastern Mediterranean, but a much wider region, including parts of Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia. The paleoclimatic evidence for the drought comes from multiple independent sources and is increasingly regarded as robust. Analysis of sediment cores from the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and other lakes in the Levant has revealed declining lake levels during the period in question, indicating reduced rainfall. Pollen analysis from cores taken in coastal lagoons and lake beds shows a shift from agricultural vegetation to drought-resistant scrubland, indicating that cultivation was declining. Tree ring analysis from Anatolian juniper and oak samples shows a period of reduced growth rings, indicating moisture stress during the late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era. The convergence of these independent lines of evidence from geographically dispersed sources makes a strong case for a regional drought of significant severity and duration, a drought that would have had serious consequences for the agricultural economies of the late Bronze Age kingdoms. The evidence for drought is particularly compelling at the site of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, where grain deliveries from Egypt are documented in the diplomatic correspondence of the late 13th century, suggesting that the Hittite Empire was experiencing food shortages that it could not resolve from its own agricultural resources, and that it was dependent on Egyptian grain imports to feed its population. A letter from the Hittite king to the pharaoh, found in the Hattusa archives, contains a plea that is remarkable for its directness. The letter states that the land of Hatti is starving, that there is no grain, and that the pharaoh must send ships loaded with grain to prevent a catastrophe. The fact that a great king, a ruler who was the diplomatic equal of the pharaoh, was reduced to begging for food aid from his rival is a measure of the severity of the crisis and of the desperation of the Hittite state in the final decades before its collapse. The drought would have had cascading effects across the entire late Bronze Age system. Reduced agricultural productivity would have led to food shortages, which would have led to social unrest, which would have weakened the political authority of the palace elites, which would have reduced their capacity to maintain the military forces and the administrative infrastructure on which the stability of the kingdom depended. The food shortages would also have increased pressure on the trade networks, as kingdoms that could not feed their populations from domestic production would have competed more aggressively for imported grain, driving up prices, straining diplomatic relationships, and creating the conditions for conflict between states that had previously coexisted in a framework of diplomatic cooperation. The relationship between food shortage and political instability in the late Bronze Age is not merely theoretical. The palace economies of the great powers were systems in which the ruler's legitimacy depended, in significant part, on the ruler's ability to feed the population. The palace collected agricultural produce from the cultivators, stored it in massive granaries, and redistributed it to the workers, soldiers, priests, and other dependents who served the palace. When the granaries were full, the system worked. When the harvests failed, the system broke down, Because the palace could not fulfill its redistributive obligations, the workers went unpaid, the soldiers went unfed, and the authority of the ruler, which depended on his capacity to provide, was undermined. The drought of the late 13th and early 12th centuries would have struck at the very foundation of the palace economies, undermining the capacity of the rulers to maintain the social contract on which their authority rested. And it gets worse. The drought was not the only environmental factor at work. The late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era were also a period of increased seismic activity in the eastern Mediterranean, a region that lies along the boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, and that is one of the most seismically active regions in the world. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites across the region, including Mycenae, Tiryns, Midea, and Ugarit, shows evidence of earthquake damage dating to the period of the collapse, and some scholars have argued that a series of major earthquakes, possibly occurring within a relatively short time frame, may have contributed to the destruction of the palace complexes and the disruption of the infrastructure on which the late Bronze Age economy depended. The archaeological evidence for the destruction of the late Bronze Age cities is itself complex and often ambiguous. At some sites, the destruction layer shows clear evidence of fire, suggesting deliberate burning by an attacking force. At others, the evidence is more consistent with earthquake damage, with collapsed walls, displaced foundations, and the characteristic pattern of destruction that geologists associate with seismic events. At still others, the evidence suggests a combination of causes, with earthquake damage weakening structures that were then deliberately burned, either by attackers exploiting the chaos or by the inhabitants themselves as they abandoned the site. The ambiguity of the archaeological evidence has fueled decades of scholarly debate about the relative importance of warfare, natural disaster, and internal collapse in the destruction of the late Bronze Age cities. The earthquake hypothesis deserves closer examination because the evidence for seismic activity during the period of the collapse is substantial, and because earthquake damage can mimic the effects of warfare in the archaeological record, making it difficult to distinguish between the two without careful scientific analysis. The geologist Amos Nur has argued that a series of major earthquakes, collectively forming what he calls an earthquake storm, struck the eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era, damaging cities across the region and contributing to the disruption of trade, the displacement of populations, and the general instability that characterized the period of the collapse. Muir's earthquake storm hypothesis is supported by geological evidence of seismic activity during the period in question, and by the distribution of destruction across the eastern Mediterranean, which follows the seismic zones that run along the plate boundaries of the African, Arabian, and Eurasian tectonic plates. The difficulty with the earthquake hypothesis, as with the invasion hypothesis and the drought hypothesis, is that earthquakes alone cannot explain the completeness of the collapse. Earthquake had struck the eastern Mediterranean before, during the height of the late Bronze Age, and the palace civilizations had survived them, repairing the damage and continuing to function. The earthquakes of the late 13th and early 12th centuries, if they occurred, would have been devastating, but they would not necessarily have been fatal to civilizations that had survived similar disasters in the past. The key insight of the system's collapse model is that it was not any single factor that brought down the system, but the convergence of multiple factors, each of which weakened the system's capacity to absorb the others, creating a synergistic effect that was greater than the sum of its parts. The earthquakes weakened the infrastructure, the drought weakened the agricultural base, the trade disruptions weakened the economy, the internal tensions weakened the political order, and the Sea Peoples exploited the resulting vulnerability to attack kingdoms that were no longer capable of defending themselves. The economic dimension of the collapse is equally important. The late Bronze Age economy was based on the trade in bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that gave the age its name, and that was the essential material for the production of weapons, tools, and armor. The production of bronze required access to both copper and tin, and while copper was relatively abundant, Available from the mines of Cyprus and other sources in the eastern Mediterranean, tin was rare and had to be imported from distant sources, probably from the mines of Afghanistan, Central Asia, or possibly Cornwall in southwestern England. The tin trade was one of the longest and most complex supply chains in the ancient world, passing through multiple intermediaries and crossing thousands of kilometers of land and sea before reaching the workshops of the Mediterranean kingdoms. The disruption of the tin supply, whether by the collapse of the intermediary states that facilitated the trade, by the interdiction of the trade routes by hostile forces, or by the failure of the mining communities themselves, would have had devastating consequences for the economies of the late Bronze Age kingdoms, depriving them of the raw material that was essential for their military and economic systems. The consequences of tin disruption would have been immediate and severe. Without tin, bronze could not be produced. Without bronze, weapons and armor could not be manufactured. Without weapons and armor, armies could not be equipped. Without equipped armies, kingdoms could not defend themselves, could not enforce their authority, and could not maintain the order on which the functioning of the palace economy depended. The disruption of the tin trade would not merely have reduced economic output, it would have undermined the military capacity of the palace states and, with it, the political authority that depended on military power. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, which followed the collapse, may have been driven in part by the interruption of the tin supply, as communities that could no longer obtain the tin needed for bronze production turned to the more abundant but technologically more demanding iron as a substitute. The irony is that iron, which would eventually prove to be a superior material for tools and weapons, was initially adopted not because of its superiority but because of necessity, because the tin that was needed to make bronze was no longer available. The collapse of the Hittite Empire provides the most dramatic example of the speed and the completeness of the late Bronze Age destruction. The Hittite state, which had been one of the 2 or 3 most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world for more than 3 centuries, disappeared from history so completely that by the time of the classical Greeks, a few centuries later, no one remembered that it had ever existed. The Hittites, who had fought the Egyptians to a standstill at Kadesh, who had negotiated the first known international peace treaty, who had maintained a sophisticated system of government, law, and diplomacy, were erased from human memory as though they had never been. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, was destroyed by fire sometime around 1180 before the Common Era. The evidence from the site suggests that the city was evacuated before its destruction, because the archives and the most valuable portable objects were removed, leaving behind only the heavy stone structures and the objects that were too bulky to carry. The evacuation suggests that the Hittite elite saw the destruction coming and had time to prepare for it, but that they were unable or unwilling to defend the city against whatever force was approaching. Whether that force was the Sea Peoples, a rebellious vassal population, the Casca peoples of the northern mountains, or some combination of external and internal enemies, the result was the same. Hattusa burned, and the Hittite Empire ceased to exist. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at western Thebes, provide the most detailed ancient account of the Sea Peoples and their attacks on the eastern Mediterranean. The inscriptions describe 2 major military engagements between the Egyptians and the Sea Peoples, a land battle and a naval battle that took place in approximately 1178 before the Common Era, during the 8th year of the pharaoh's reign. The inscriptions are accompanied by dramatic relief carvings that depict the battles in vivid detail, showing Egyptian soldiers and sailors fighting against warriors who are depicted with distinctive feathered headdresses, round shields, and long swords, visual markers that are unlike the equipment of any other known people in the ancient Near East, and that have been the subject of intense scholarly analysis. The naval battle depicted at Medinet Habu is one of the earliest representations of a naval engagement in the history of art, and the detail of the carving provides valuable information about the naval technology and tactics of both the Egyptians and the Sea Peoples. The Egyptian ships are shown as large, oared vessels with high prows and sterns, manned by rows of oarsmen and by archers who rain arrows on the enemy fleet. The Sea People's ships are shown as smaller, sail-powered vessels with distinctive bird-head prows, manned by warriors armed with swords and shields. The Egyptian strategy, as depicted in the reliefs, appears to have involved grappling the Sea People's ships and pulling them close enough for the Egyptian archers and marines to board or sink them, a strategy that exploited the Egyptians' advantage in manpower and archery. The land battle is depicted with equal vividness. The Sea Peoples are shown advancing with ox carts carrying women and children, a detail that has been crucial to the scholarly interpretation of the Sea Peoples as a migrating population rather than a purely military force. The Egyptian army, led by the pharaoh in his chariot, is shown defeating the Sea Peoples in a pitched battle, with Egyptian soldiers killing and capturing the enemy warriors while the ox carts are overturned and the women and children are taken prisoner. The presence of women and children in the depiction is significant because it distinguishes the Sea People's migration from a conventional military campaign in which only warriors would be present, and suggests that the Sea Peoples were seeking not merely plunder but new lands in which to settle permanently. The Medinet Habu inscriptions name the peoples who composed the Sea Peoples coalition, the Peleset, who are widely identified with the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible, the Jekka, who may be related to the Homeric Teucrians, or the people of the Troad, the Shekelesh, who have been tentatively connected to the Sicels of Sicily, the Denyen, who may be the Danans of Homeric tradition or the people of Adana in Cilicia, the Weshesh, whose identity remains entirely obscure, and several other groups whose names appear in earlier Egyptian inscriptions dating to the reigns of Meneptah and Rameses II, including the Luca, who may be the Lycians of southwestern Anatolia, the Sherdan, who have been connected to Sardinia, and the Ekwesh, who may be the Achaeans, the Greeks of the Homeric tradition. It is important to note that earlier encounters with the Sea Peoples, or groups associated with them, predated the battles of Ramesses III. The pharaoh Meneptah, who ruled approximately 1213 to 1203 before the Common Era, fought a major battle against a Libyan invasion force that included groups identified as Sherdan, Shekelesh, Lucca and Tertia, the latter tentatively identified with the Etruscans of later Italian history. The Meneptah Stela, which records this victory, provides the earliest clear reference to the Sea Peoples as a military threat to the established order of the Eastern Mediterranean. Even earlier, during the reign of Ramesses II, Sherdan warriors appear in the Egyptian record as both enemies and mercenaries, fighting against Egypt in one campaign and serving as elite royal bodyguards in the next, a dual role that complicates any simple narrative of the Sea Peoples as a unified hostile force. The appearance of Sea Peoples groups as both enemies and allies in the Egyptian record suggests that the phenomenon was complex and varied, encompassing both hostile raids and voluntary enlistment in the service of the established powers. The Sea Peoples were not a monolithic entity. They were a diverse collection of groups, some hostile, some opportunistic, some desperate, who were drawn into the vortex of the collapse from different starting points and for different reasons. The identifications are tantalizing but uncertain. The Egyptian scribes recorded the names of the Sea Peoples in Egyptian hieroglyphs, which do not record vowels, making the precise pronunciation of the names uncertain, and the identification of the peoples they refer to a matter of scholarly conjecture rather than established fact. The connections between the Egyptian names and the later peoples of the Mediterranean, the Philistines, the Sicels, the Sardinians, the Greeks, are plausible but not proven, and the debate about the identification of the Sea Peoples remains one of the most active and most contentious areas of research in Bronze Age studies. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe the Sea Peoples not merely as raiders or pirates, but as a mass migration, a movement of entire peoples, men, women and children, travelling in ox carts and in ships, destroying everything in their path and seeking new lands in which to settle. The inscriptions state that no land could stand before their arms, that they destroyed Hatti, Kode, Karchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia, great kingdoms and city-states that had been among the most powerful in the ancient world, and that they established a camp in the land of Amuru, on the coast of modern Syria, from which they launched their attacks on Egypt. If the Egyptian account is even approximately accurate, then the Sea Peoples were not a band of opportunistic raiders, but a force of civilizational destruction, a movement of displaced populations that swept through the eastern Mediterranean like a wave, destroying the existing political order and replacing it with chaos. The scholarly debate about the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse has produced a range of theories, each of which captures a part of the truth, and none of which captures all of it. The theories can be broadly divided into those that emphasize external factors, the Sea Peoples themselves as the primary agents of destruction, and those that emphasize internal factors, the structural weaknesses of the late Bronze Age system that made it vulnerable to collapse. The most convincing recent scholarship has increasingly moved toward a systems collapse model, which argues that the destruction of the late Bronze Age world was the result of multiple interacting factors, no single one of which was sufficient to bring down the system, but whose combined effect was catastrophic. The first and oldest theory, the invasion hypothesis, holds that the Sea Peoples were an external military force, a coalition of migrating warrior peoples from the Western Mediterranean, the Aegean, or the European mainland, who invaded the Eastern Mediterranean, destroyed the existing kingdoms by military force, and established themselves in the territories of the conquered peoples. This theory dominated scholarly thinking about the Bronze Age collapse for much of the 20th century, and it draws its primary support from the Medinet Habu inscriptions, which describe the Sea Peoples as a devastating military force that destroyed multiple kingdoms before being stopped by Egypt. The invasion hypothesis has the appeal of simplicity. It identifies a single cause, the Sea Peoples' invasion, and a single mechanism, military conquest, for the collapse of the late Bronze Age world. The invasion hypothesis also drew support from the 19th and early 20th century scholarly tradition that interpreted the end of the Bronze Age through the lens of the great migrations of the early medieval period, the movements of the Germanic, Slavic, and Turkic peoples that contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. Scholars trained in this tradition naturally looked for analogous population movements to explain the Bronze Age collapse, and the Sea Peoples, as described in the Egyptian inscriptions, seemed to provide the perfect analogy, a barbarian invasion that overwhelmed a civilized world, just as the Germanic invasions had overwhelmed Rome. The analogy was powerful but misleading, because it assumed that the Bronze Age collapse and the fall of Rome had the same causes and the same mechanisms, an assumption that the archaeological evidence does not support. But here is the problem with the invasion hypothesis. The archaeological evidence does not consistently support it. While some sites show clear evidence of violent destruction by an attacking force, others show no evidence of warfare at all, with destruction layers that are more consistent with earthquake damage, fire of uncertain origin, or gradual abandonment. The Mycenaean palace at Pylos, for example, was destroyed by fire around 1200 before the Common Era, and the destruction is often attributed to Sea Peoples' raiders. But the site shows no evidence of a battle, no weapons embedded in walls, no unburied dead, no defensive preparations that would indicate an imminent attack. The palace simply burned, and the evidence does not tell us whether the fire was set by raiders, by domestic insurgents, by accident, or by the inhabitants themselves as they abandoned the site. The same ambiguity characterizes many other destruction sites across the eastern Mediterranean. At Ugarit, the great trading city on the Syrian coast, the destruction layer shows evidence of intense fire, but the evidence for a military assault is limited to a few arrowheads found in the destruction debris and to the famous last letter found in the kiln, which describes an approaching enemy fleet. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the destruction is extensive but selective, with some buildings burned and others apparently abandoned intact, a pattern that is more consistent with an organized evacuation followed by deliberate destruction than with a sudden military assault. At Mycenae itself, the destruction was phased, with the citadel surviving the initial wave of destruction and continuing to be occupied for several decades before being finally abandoned, a pattern that is difficult to reconcile with a single overwhelming military attack. The math is striking when we consider the logistics of the invasion hypothesis. A military force capable of destroying the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms, the Levantine city-states, and the other victims of the collapse would have had to be enormous, numbering in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of warriors, supported by a supply chain and a logistical infrastructure that would have been beyond the capacity of any known polity of the period. The late Bronze Age kingdoms maintained professional armies of thousands of soldiers, equipped with bronze weapons and armor, supported by chariot forces, and backed by the resources of palace economies that could mobilize the agricultural surplus of entire kingdoms for military purposes. The idea that a coalition of tribal or semi-tribal peoples, lacking the organizational capacity and the economic resources of the palace states, could have defeated these armies in battle after battle across a region stretching from Greece to Egypt strains credulity. The invasion hypothesis requires us to believe that the Sea Peoples were militarily superior to every one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age, a proposition that the evidence does not support. A second theory, the systems collapse model, was most influentially articulated by the historian Robert Drews in his 1993 book On the End of the Bronze Age, and has been further developed by the archaeologist Eric Klein in his widely read 2014 study of the collapse. The systems collapse model argues that the Bronze Age collapse was not the result of a single cause, but of multiple interacting factors that converged during the late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era to overwhelm the resilience of the late Bronze Age system. The factors include climate change and drought, which reduced agricultural productivity and created food shortages, earthquakes, which damaged infrastructure and disrupted economic activity, the disruption of the international trade networks, which deprived kingdoms of the essential raw materials on which their economies depended, internal social and political tensions, including peasant revolts and elite power struggles, which weakened the political authority of the palace states, and the migrations and attacks of the Sea Peoples, which added military pressure to a system that was already under severe stress from environmental, economic, and political factors. The systems collapse model is more satisfying than the invasion hypothesis because it accounts for the diversity and the complexity of the archaeological evidence. It explains why some sites were destroyed by warfare while others were destroyed by earthquake or abandoned without evidence of violence. It explains why the collapse was not simultaneous across the region but occurred over a period of several decades, with different kingdoms falling at different times and for different reasons. And it explains why the collapse was so complete, why the entire late Bronze Age system fell apart, rather than simply undergoing a change of leadership or a realignment of political power, because it was not a single event but a cascade of mutually reinforcing failures that overwhelmed the capacity of any individual kingdom to cope. Klein's contribution to the debate has been particularly significant for bringing the systems collapse model to a wider audience. His book, which draws on a comprehensive survey of the archaeological, textual, and scientific evidence from across the Eastern Mediterranean, argues that the collapse was caused by a perfect storm of interconnected catastrophes that the late Bronze Age kingdoms had no framework for understanding and no mechanism for addressing. Klein compares the collapse to a modern scenario in which climate change, economic disruption, political instability, and military conflict converge to produce a cascade of failures that overwhelms the capacity of modern institutions to respond, a comparison that has given the Bronze Age collapse a contemporary resonance that earlier scholarly treatments had lacked. A third theory focuses on internal revolution. According to this view, the destruction of the late Bronze Age palaces was not the work of external invaders, but of the domestic populations of the palace states themselves, populations that had been exploited and oppressed by the palace elites, and that rose in revolt when the palace system was weakened by drought, famine, and the disruption of trade. This theory draws support from the archaeological evidence at some sites, where the destruction appears to have been selective, targeting the palace complex and the buildings associated with the elite. while leaving the surrounding residential areas relatively intact, a pattern that is more consistent with a targeted domestic uprising than with an indiscriminate external attack. The theory also draws support from the observation that, at many sites, the post-collapse occupation shows a marked decrease in social complexity and a more egalitarian distribution of wealth and resources, as though the hierarchical social structures of the palace period had been deliberately dismantled and replaced by a more decentralized and less stratified form of social organization. The internal revolution theory has an analogy in the Linear B tablets from Pylos, which record the mobilization of rowers and watchers along the coast in the period immediately before the palace's destruction, suggesting that the palace administration was aware of an approaching threat and was taking defensive measures. But the tablets also record the redistribution of bronze from temple offerings for the production of weapons, a desperate measure that suggests the palace was running out of the materials needed to equip its defenders. The image that emerges from the Pylos tablets is of a palace administration under extreme stress, scrambling to organize a defense against a threat that it did not fully understand and that it lacked the resources to counter. Whether the threat that ultimately destroyed Pylos was external, the sea peoples, or internal, a domestic revolt, or some combination of both, the tablets confirm that the palace administration was aware that the end was near and was unable to prevent it. A fourth theory, the migration hypothesis, proposes that the sea peoples were not invaders or raiders but refugees, displaced populations fleeing the collapse of their own homelands and seeking new territories in which to settle. According to this view, the collapse began in the Aegean or in western Anatolia, where drought, famine, or political instability drove populations from their homelands and set in motion a chain reaction of migration and displacement that swept through the eastern Mediterranean. The displaced populations, desperate and armed, attacked the kingdoms they encountered, not out of aggressive intent, but out of the need for food, land, and survival. The kingdoms they attacked, already weakened by the same environmental and economic stresses that had driven the migrants from their homelands, were unable to resist, and the result was a cascade of destruction that propagated through the system like a wave, each collapse generating new refugees who in turn attacked and destroyed their neighbors. The migration hypothesis is supported by the Medinet Habu inscriptions, which describe the sea peoples as traveling with their families and in their possessions, in ox carts and in ships, a description that is more consistent with a population movement than with a military campaign. It is also supported by the archaeological evidence from several sites, including the Philistine cities of the southern Levant, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath, where the material culture of the early Iron Age shows clear Aegean affinities, suggesting that the Peliset, the Philistines, who settled in this region after the collapse were indeed of Aegean origin, as the Medinet Habu inscriptions suggest. The evidence from the Philistine cities is particularly important because it provides one of the few concrete links between the sea peoples of the Egyptian inscriptions and the archaeological record. Excavations at Ashkelon, conducted by the Harvard archaeologist Lawrence Stager and his colleagues from the 1980s onward, and at Ekron, conducted by Trude Dothan and Seymour Gittin, revealed a material culture in the early Iron Age strata that included Mycenaean-style pottery, Aegean-style hearths, Aegean-style loom weights, and dietary practices, including the consumption of pork, that were characteristic of the Aegean world, and that were markedly different from the Canaanite cultural traditions of the region. The archaeological evidence from Ashkelon is particularly detailed and informative. The earliest Iron Age levels at the site contain pottery that archaeologists classify as Mycenaean IIC, a distinctive pottery style that is associated with the final phase of the Mycenaean tradition, and that is found at sites across the eastern Mediterranean in the period immediately following the collapse. The presence of locally made Mycenaean IIC pottery at Ashkelon, rather than imported pottery, indicates that the people who settled at Ashkelon after the collapse brought with them the knowledge and the skills of the Mycenaean potting tradition, and that they continued to produce pottery in the Mycenaean style at their new home using local clays and local materials. The gradual transformation of this pottery over the following generations, from recognizably Mycenaean forms to the distinctive bichrome pottery of the mature Philistine culture, documents the process of cultural adaptation through which the Aegean immigrants absorbed elements of the local Canaanite tradition while retaining distinctive features of their own heritage. The evidence strongly suggests that the Philistines were Aegean migrants who settled in the southern Levant in the wake of the collapse, bringing their material culture with them and gradually adapting to the local environment over the following centuries. Recent ancient DNA analysis of individuals buried at Ashkelon has confirmed the Aegean connection, revealing genetic affinities with populations from southern Europe and the Aegean that are consistent with an immigrant origin for the early Philistine population. The DNA evidence also shows that the Aegean genetic component diminished over time, as the Philistine population intermarried with the local Canaanite population, a pattern that is consistent with the gradual cultural assimilation documented in the pottery sequence. The story of the Philistines provides a rare example of a Sea Peoples group that can be traced from the Egyptian inscriptions to a specific archaeological context in the post-collapse period, and it demonstrates that at least some of the Sea Peoples were indeed Aegean in origin, and that they did indeed settle in new territories after the collapse, as the Medinet Habu inscriptions describe. Whether the other groups named in the inscriptions, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, followed similar trajectories, settling in new territories and establishing new communities, remains uncertain because the archaeological evidence for these other groups is far less complete than the evidence for the Philistines. The numbers are striking when we tally the scale of destruction across the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled a territory of more than 500,000 square kilometers and had maintained diplomatic and military parity with Egypt for more than 2 centuries, was destroyed so completely that its very existence was forgotten until the 19th century of the Common Era. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece, which had controlled a network of palace-centered kingdoms across the southern Aegean, and which had produced the earliest known form of written Greek, collapsed into a dark age from which no written records survive for more than 3 centuries. The great trading city of Ugarit, which had maintained commercial relationships with every major kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean, and which had developed the earliest known alphabetic script, was destroyed and never reoccupied. The kingdom of Alatia, Cyprus, which had been the primary source of copper for the late Bronze Age economy, experienced a severe disruption that lasted for more than a century. Across the region, population levels declined dramatically. Some estimates suggest by as much as 70 to 90% in some areas, as cities were abandoned, agriculture contracted, and the trade networks that had sustained the urban populations ceased to function. Let us now consider the evidence from specific sites, because the details of the destruction vary significantly from place to place, and because the variation itself is informative about the nature and the causes of the collapse. The destruction of Ugarit is one of the best documented episodes of the collapse, because the city's archives, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, provide a window into the final years of the city that is unavailable for most other sites. The tablets from the last phase of the city's occupation, dating to approximately 1200 to 1185 before the Common Era, document a kingdom under increasing stress, struggling to meet the military demands of its Hittite overlord while simultaneously defending itself against threats from the sea. One letter, from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alatia, describes an attack on the city by an enemy fleet and requests assistance. Another letter, from the king of Alatia, responds by asking the king of Ugarit to report on the enemy's strength and whereabouts. A third letter, the famous last letter of Ugarit, was found still in the kiln where it was being fired, never sent, its content a desperate plea for help against an enemy that had already burned the city's fleet and was approaching by sea. The letter's recipient is unknown, but its content is unmistakable. The king of Ugarit was facing an existential threat, and he was alone. His army was deployed in Hittite territory, far from home. His fleet had been destroyed. His allies were unable or unwilling to help. The city fell, and the letter remained in the kiln, a monument to the moment when the system of international cooperations that had sustained the late Bronze Age world failed for the last time. The archaeological evidence from Ugarit adds detail to the picture provided by the letters. The destruction layer at the site shows evidence of intense burning, confirming that the city was destroyed by fire. The distribution of destruction within the city is relatively uniform, suggesting that the entire city was consumed in a single conflagration rather than being destroyed piecemeal over a period of time. The city was never reoccupied. After the destruction, the site was abandoned and remained unoccupied for centuries, until a new settlement was eventually established nearby, but not on the same location. The permanence of the abandonment suggests that the destruction was total, that the population was either killed, captured, or dispersed, and that no community remained with the resources or the will to rebuild. The evidence from the site of Emar, a major trading city on the Middle Euphrates in modern Syria, provides another window into the final years of the late Bronze Age. The tablets from Emar document a city that was increasingly isolated from its former trading partners, struggling to maintain its economic activity in the face of disrupted trade routes and hostile forces. The archives from the final phase of the city record legal disputes, property transactions, and religious rituals that suggest a community trying to maintain normalcy in the face of mounting crisis, going through the motions of civilized life, even as the foundations of that life were crumbling around them. The records also suggest increasing social tensions within the community, with disputes over property and resources becoming more frequent and more bitter as the economic situation deteriorated. The city was destroyed sometime around 1185 before the Common Era, apparently by an attack from the east rather than from the sea, a detail that complicates the narrative of the Sea Peoples as the sole agents of destruction and suggests that the collapse involved multiple hostile forces converging on the settled civilizations of the Near East from different directions. The evidence from Emar reminds us that the Bronze Age collapse was not a single event, but a process, a cascade of failures that unfolded over several decades and that involved multiple actors, multiple causes, and multiple theatres of destruction. The evidence from the Mycenaean world tells a similar story of multi-phase destruction, followed by abandonment and cultural regression. The palace at Pylos was destroyed by fire around 1200 before the Common Era and was never rebuilt. The citadel at Mycenae survived the initial wave of destruction, but was occupied at a reduced level for several decades before being finally abandoned. The palace at Tiryns was destroyed, but the site continued to be occupied, at a much reduced level, into the early Iron Age. The pattern is one of progressive decline rather than sudden catastrophe, a decline that played out over several decades, and that left different sites in different states of destruction and abandonment, a pattern that is consistent with the system's collapse model, and that is difficult to reconcile with a single, overwhelming military attack. The case of Mycenae itself is particularly instructive. The citadel at Mycenae, with its massive cyclopean walls and its famous Lion Gate, was one of the most heavily fortified sites in the Bronze Age Aegean, and it survived the initial wave of destruction that consumed other Mycenaean palaces around 1200 before the Common Era. The citadel continued to be occupied for several decades after the destruction of Pylos and the other palaces, but the character of the occupation changed dramatically. The Grand Palace on the summit of the citadel was destroyed, but smaller, more modest buildings were constructed within the walls, and the population that remained was a fraction of the size of the palace period community. The material culture of the post-destruction occupation shows a marked decline in quality and diversity, with the fine-painted pottery of the palace period replaced by simpler, less elaborately decorated wares, and with evidence of long-distance trade virtually disappearing. The citadel eventually went out of use sometime in the early 11th century, before the Common Era, roughly a century after the initial destruction of the Mycenaean palace system, a timeline that suggests a gradual decline rather than a single catastrophic event. The deeper truth about the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse is that the collapse reveals the fundamental fragility of complex, interconnected civilizations a fragility that is not a defect of any particular civilization, but a structural feature of complexity itself. The Late Bronze Age world was, by the standards of its time, a global civilization, a network of interconnected kingdoms that depended on each other for essential resources, for diplomatic support, and for the maintenance of the international order that sustained them all. The system was powerful, productive, and resilient under normal conditions, but it was also brittle, vulnerable to cascading failure when subjected to multiple simultaneous stresses, because the very interconnections that made the system powerful also made it vulnerable, transmitting the effects of local failures across the entire network and amplifying them into systemic catastrophe. Let that sink in. The concept of cascading failure, familiar from modern studies of power grids, financial systems, and ecological networks, provides a useful framework for understanding the Bronze Age collapse. In a cascading failure, the failure of one component of a system overloads other components, causing them to fail in turn, each failure increasing the load on the remaining components and making further failures more likely. The process is self-reinforcing, with each failure making the next more probable until the entire system collapses. The Late Bronze Age system was vulnerable to cascading failure because its components were tightly coupled, because the failure of one kingdom or one trade route could not be isolated from the rest of the system, because the effects of local failures propagated through the network of trade and diplomatic relationships that connected the kingdoms, overwhelming the compensatory mechanisms that might have contained the damage under normal circumstances. The Late Bronze Age collapse was not the result of a single cause. It was the result of a perfect storm, a convergence of multiple crises that interacted with and amplified each other in ways that no individual crisis could have done on its own. Drought reduced agricultural productivity. Food shortages weakened the political authority of the palace elites. The weakened elites were less able to maintain the trade networks on which their economies depended. The disruption of trade-deprived kingdoms of essential raw materials, particularly tin, without which bronze could not be produced. The loss of bronze undermined military capacity. The weakened military was less able to defend against external threats, including the migrations and attacks of the Sea Peoples. The migrations of the Sea Peoples, themselves driven by the same environmental and economic stresses that were affecting the palace kingdoms, added military pressure to a system that was already under severe stress, and the cascading failures fed on each other, each failure making the next more likely and more severe until the entire system collapsed. This is not science fiction, it is documented history. The evidence comes from Egyptian inscriptions, Hittite archives, Ugaritic tablets, Mycenaean Linear B texts, archaeological excavation, paleoclimatic research, and scientific analysis of material remains from dozens of sites across the eastern Mediterranean. The evidence is abundant, diverse, and convergent, and while the details remain debated, the broad outlines of the collapse are clear. A civilization that had endured for centuries, that had achieved a level of international cooperation and cultural exchange that would not be matched for a millennium, fell apart in roughly 50 years. And the world that emerged from the wreckage was fundamentally different from the world that had preceded it. The speed of the collapse is one of its most striking and most disturbing features. The Late Bronze Age system did not decline gradually over a period of centuries, as the Roman Empire would later do. It collapsed within the span of roughly 2 generations, a period so short that individuals who were born into the world of the palace civilizations could have lived long enough to see the utter destruction of everything they had known. The speed of the collapse suggests that the system, once it began to fail, failed rapidly, with each failure triggering the next in a cascade that accelerated as it propagated through the network. The speed also suggests that the resilience of the system, its capacity to absorb shocks and maintain its essential functions, was not a continuous variable that declined gradually, but a threshold variable that held steady until it was exceeded, and then collapsed all at once, like a dam that holds back the water until the moment it breaks. The aftermath of the collapse is as important as the collapse itself, because the aftermath reveals the depth and the permanence of the damage that was done. The centuries that followed the collapse, roughly 1200 to 900 before the Common Era, are known as the Dark Ages of the Eastern Mediterranean, a period characterized by depopulation, cultural regression, the loss of literacy, the abandonment of urban centers, and the fragmentation of the political landscape into small, isolated communities that lack the resources, the organization, and the cultural traditions of the palace civilizations that had preceded them. In Greece, the loss was particularly severe. The Mycenaean script, Linear B, disappeared from use, and Greece became an illiterate society, unable to record its own history, for a period of roughly 3 centuries. The monumental architecture of the Mycenaean period gave way to modest, often impermanent structures. The long-distance trade that had connected the Mycenaean kingdoms to the wider world ceased almost entirely. The population declined dramatically, and the social complexity of the Mycenaean period was replaced by a simpler, more egalitarian, and much poorer way of life. When literacy finally returned to Greece in the 8th century before the Common Era, it came in a new form, the Greek alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, and the world that the new literacy described was so different from the world of the Mycenaean palaces that the Greeks themselves did not recognize the connection between the two, preserving the memory of the Mycenaean period only in the myths and legends of the heroic age, stories of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus that were transmitted orally for centuries before being written down in the works of Homer. In the Levant, the aftermath was equally devastating, but took a different form. The great trading cities of the coast, Ugarit, Alalak, and others, were destroyed and never reoccupied. The international trade networks that had sustained them ceased to function. But from the ashes of the old order, new peoples and new polities emerged. Peoples who would shape the history of the region for the next millennium and beyond. The Philistines, apparently of Aegean origin, established themselves along the southern coast in the cities of Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath, creating a confederation of city-states that played a major role in the political history of the region during the early Iron Age. The Phoenicians, heirs to the Canaanite trading tradition, rebuilt the cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, and eventually developed a maritime trading empire that extended across the entire Mediterranean, from the coast of modern Lebanon to the Strait of Gibraltar and beyond. The Phoenician contribution to the aftermath of the collapse was particularly significant because it was the Phoenicians who developed the alphabetic script that would eventually be adopted by the Greeks, and that would become the ancestor of virtually every alphabetic writing system in use in the modern world. The Phoenician alphabet, which reduced the complexity of the earlier cuneiform and hieroglyphic writing systems to a simple set of roughly 24 consonantal signs, democratized literacy in a way that the palace-controlled writing systems of the Bronze Age never had, making it possible for merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens to read and write, and laying the foundation for the literary, philosophical, and historical traditions that would distinguish the classical civilizations from their Bronze Age predecessors. The Israelite kingdoms emerged in the highlands of the interior, developing the religious and literary traditions that would have an incalculable influence on the subsequent history of Western civilization. The emergence of Israel in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse is itself a complex and much debated topic, but it is clear that the political vacuum created by the collapse of Egyptian and Hittite authority in the Levant provided the conditions in which new polities could emerge and develop, free from the constraints of the great power system that had dominated the region during the late Bronze Age. The aftermath of the collapse was not merely a period of darkness and decline, it was also a period of transformation in which new peoples, new cultures, and new political forms emerged from the wreckage of the old order, laying the foundations for the classical civilizations that would eventually succeed them. The destruction cleared the ground for innovation, removing the rigid palace bureaucracies and the entrenched elite power structures that had controlled the Bronze Age economies, and creating space for new forms of social organization, new technologies, and new ways of thinking that might never have developed within the constraints of the palace system. In Anatolia, the collapse of the Hittite Empire left a vacuum that was filled by a patchwork of smaller states, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms of southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, the Phrygian kingdom that eventually established itself in the former Hittite heartland, and the Lydian kingdom that would become famous in classical Greek tradition for the wealth of its king, Croesus. The continuity between the Hittite Empire and the Neo-Hittite kingdoms that succeeded it demonstrates that the collapse, however devastating, did not completely erase the cultural traditions of the Late Bronze Age. Some elements of Hittite culture, including artistic styles, religious practices, and the Luwian hieroglyphic script, survived in the Neo-Hittite kingdoms for several centuries after the fall of Hattusa, providing a bridge between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age that preserved at least some of the achievements of the earlier period. In Egypt, the aftermath of the collapse was different again. Egypt was the only major power of the Late Bronze Age that survived the collapse, though it was severely weakened by the experience. Ramesses III's victory over the Sea Peoples, celebrated so prominently in the Medinet Habu inscriptions, was Egypt's last great military achievement of the Bronze Age, and the kingdom that followed was a shadow of its former self, weakened by economic decline, political fragmentation, and the loss of its foreign empire. The new kingdom came to an end in approximately 1070 before the Common Era, roughly a century after the Sea Peoples battles, and was followed by a period of division and decline known as the Third Intermediate Period, in which Egypt was ruled by competing dynasties, sometimes simultaneously, and in which the country's influence in the wider Mediterranean world was dramatically reduced. The survival of Egypt was real but incomplete, and the Egypt that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was a very different country from the Egypt that had entered it. The Papyrus Harris, the longest surviving papyrus from ancient Egypt, provides a detailed account of the reign of Ramesses III and offers a glimpse into the economic conditions of post-collapse Egypt. The document records the enormous wealth that Ramesses donated to the temples of Egypt, but it also reveals the economic strains that the kingdom was experiencing, including the first recorded labor strike in history, when the workers at the royal tomb complex at Deir el-Medina refused to work because their rations had not been delivered. The failure of the ration system, the mechanism by which the palace economy distributed food and other necessities to workers and dependents, was a sign of the economic distress that the collapse had inflicted on Egypt's economy and of the declining capacity of the palace administration to fulfill its obligations to the population it governed. The question of why Egypt survived while the other great powers did not has been debated by scholars for decades. Several factors may have contributed to Egypt's relative resilience. Egypt's agricultural economy was based on the Nile flood, a reliable and predictable source of irrigation that was less vulnerable to drought than the rain-fed agriculture of Anatolia, Greece, and the Levant. Egypt's geographic position, protected by deserts to the east and west, and by the Mediterranean to the north, made it more difficult to invade than the more accessible territories of the Near East. And Egypt's military, which was large, well-organized, and experienced in the defense of its borders, was able to defeat the Sea Peoples in battle, something that no other Late Bronze Age kingdom managed to do. But Egypt's survival was also a matter of degree. Egypt survived the collapse, but it did not survive unscathed. The collapse cost Egypt its foreign empire, its commercial networks, its diplomatic prestige, and much of its economic vitality, and the kingdom that emerged from the experience was a diminished version of the new kingdom that had preceded it. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the permanence of civilized life when we confront the reality of the Bronze Age collapse. The late Bronze Age kingdoms were not fragile or primitive societies. They were sophisticated, well-organized, militarily powerful states that had endured for centuries and that had survived numerous crises in the past. They had professional armies, palace bureaucracies, international diplomatic networks, and economic systems that were capable of mobilizing the resources of entire kingdoms for war, for trade, and for monumental construction. They were, by any reasonable standard, among the most advanced civilizations that had ever existed, and yet they fell, not one by one over a period of centuries, as one might expect, but, altogether, within a span of roughly 50 years, overwhelmed by a combination of stresses that individually they might have survived, but that collectively they could not. Let that sink in. The fragility of the Late Bronze Age system has implications that extend far beyond the specific details of the Bronze Age collapse. The Late Bronze Age world was a complex, interdependent system, a network of interconnected kingdoms that depended on each other for essential resources and that could not function in isolation. The collapse of that system demonstrates that complexity and interdependence, while they create enormous benefits in terms of productivity, prosperity, and cultural exchange, also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by shocks that the system was not designed to withstand. The concept is captured by the phrase that modern systems theorists call tight coupling. A tightly coupled system is one in which the components are so closely connected that the failure of one component immediately affects the others, leaving no time and no space for the system to compensate for the failure before it propagates through the network. The Late Bronze Age system was tightly coupled. The loss of Cypriot copper immediately affected the workshops of Greece, Egypt, and Anatolia. The fall of the Hittite Empire immediately disrupted the trade routes that passed through Anatolian territory. The destruction of Ugarit immediately eliminated the port through which much of the Levantine trade was channeled. Each loss amplified the next, and the system as a whole was less resilient than any of its individual components, because the failure of any one component overloaded the others and made their failure more likely. The Late Bronze Age kingdoms were not designed to withstand a simultaneous combination of drought, earthquake, trade disruption, internal revolt, and external invasion. No system is designed to withstand all possible shocks simultaneously. The question is not whether a complex system can be destroyed by a combination of stresses that exceeds its resilience. The question is when, and the answer, as the Bronze Age collapse demonstrates, is that the when is unpredictable because the convergence of multiple stresses is a matter of chance as much as of causation, and the tipping point at which resilience fails and collapse begins is invisible until it has already been crossed. The technologies lost in the collapse provide a particularly vivid measure of its severity. The Mycenaean script, Linear B, was lost entirely and was not deciphered until Michael Ventris accomplished the feat in 1952, more than 3,000 years after the script went out of use. The glass-making technology that had produced the glass ingots found on the Uluburun wreck, a technology that required specialized knowledge of materials and furnace design, disappeared from the eastern Mediterranean and was not recovered for centuries. The long-distance trade in tin, which had connected the mines of Central Asia to the workshops of the Mediterranean, was disrupted for so long that the Bronze Age economy gave way to the Iron Age economy, not because iron was a superior material, it was not at least initially, but because the tin needed to make bronze was no longer available. The diplomatic protocols that had governed the relationships between the great powers, the system of mutual recognition, reciprocal gift exchange, and collective security that had maintained peace across the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, was destroyed with the states that had created it and was not recreated in any comparable form until the classical period 1,000 years later. The loss of literacy is perhaps the most haunting consequence of the collapse, because it represents the loss not just of a technology, but of a capacity. The capacity to record, to preserve, and to transmit knowledge across generations. Without writing, the societies that emerged from the collapse were unable to maintain the administrative records, the historical narratives, the legal codes, and the literary traditions that had been produced by the palace civilizations. The knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of literate civilization was lost, and the societies that survived the collapse had to rebuild their cultural heritage from scratch, relying on oral tradition to preserve whatever fragments of the past could be remembered and transmitted from one generation to the next. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which preserve distorted but recognizable memories of the Mycenaean world, are the most famous product of this oral tradition, but they represent only a tiny fraction of the knowledge that was lost when the palace archives burned, and the scribes who could read them were scattered or killed. The relationship between Homer and the Bronze Age is itself one of the most fascinating aspects of the collapse's aftermath. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed in their final form sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era, roughly 4 centuries after the events they purport to describe, preserve a remarkable quantity of information about the Mycenaean world, information that was transmitted orally across the Dark Ages by generations of poets and storytellers who kept alive the memory of a world they had never seen. Homer's description of Agamemnon's kingdom, with its golden wealth, its massive fortifications, and its dominance over the other Greek kingdoms, corresponds in remarkable ways to the archaeological evidence from Mycenae itself, suggesting that the oral tradition preserved genuine memories of the palace civilization that had flourished there centuries earlier. Homer's catalogue of ships in the second book of the Iliad, which lists the contingents that sailed to Troy and names their leaders and their home cities, has been shown to correspond more closely to the political geography of Mycenaean Greece than to the political geography of Homer's own time, suggesting that the catalogue preserves a genuine Bronze Age document transmitted orally across the centuries with a fidelity that is remarkable by any standard. But Homer's memory is selective and distorted. The Homeric world knows nothing of the palace bureaucracies that administered the Mycenaean kingdoms, nothing of the Linear B script that recorded their transactions, nothing of the international diplomatic system that connected them to the great powers of the Near East. Homer's heroes are warriors and kings, men of martial valor and aristocratic pride, and the world they inhabit is a world of personal honor, individual combat, and heroic achievement, not a world of bureaucrats, tax assessors, and diplomatic protocols. The oral tradition preserved the dramatic surface of the Bronze Age world, the battles and the heroes and the tragic fall, but it lost the institutional depth, the administrative complexity, and the international context that made the Mycenaean world what it was. The loss of this institutional knowledge is perhaps the most significant consequence of the collapse, because it meant that the civilizations that rebuilt after the Dark Ages had to reinvent the institutions of complex society from scratch, without the benefit of the accumulated knowledge and experience of the Bronze Age palace civilizations. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, which followed the collapse, was not merely a change in metallurgical technology. It was a fundamental transformation of the economic, social, and political structures of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Bronze Age economy was based on centralized palace control of trade production and distribution, a system that required sophisticated bureaucratic administration and that depended on long-distance trade in strategic materials, particularly tin. The Iron Age economy that replaced it was more decentralized, more market-oriented, and less dependent on long-distance trade for essential materials, because iron ore, unlike tin, was widely available throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and could be smelted locally without the need for complex international supply chains. The alphabetic script that replaced the syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age, Linear B and cuneiform, was simpler to learn and easier to use, making literacy accessible to a wider segment of the population and enabling the development of literary, philosophical, and historical traditions that were produced not by palace bureaucrats, but by independent thinkers, poets, and historians. The classical civilizations of Greece, Phoenicia, and Israel, which emerged from the Dark Ages, were in many ways more dynamic, more creative, and more intellectually productive than the Bronze Age palace civilizations that had preceded them, but they were also more fragmented, more conflict-prone, and less capable of the kind of large-scale international cooperation that had characterized the late Bronze Age world. What does the Bronze Age collapse mean for our understanding of civilization, of the fragility of complex systems, and of our own position in history? The question is not merely academic, because the parallels between the late Bronze Age world and the modern world are too numerous and too striking to be ignored. The late Bronze Age world was, by the standards of its time, a globalized civilization. It was connected by trade networks that spanned thousands of kilometers, by diplomatic relationships that were governed by recognized norms and protocols, and by cultural exchanges that transmitted ideas technologies, and artistic styles across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age depended on each other for essential resources, just as the nations of the modern world depend on each other for oil, rare earth minerals, semiconductors, and other essential materials. The disruption of the trade routes that connected the Late Bronze Age kingdoms had cascading effects on every kingdom in the system, just as the disruption of modern supply chains, whether by pandemic, by conflict, or by natural disaster, has cascading effects on the economies of every nation in the modern world. The comparison is not perfect. The modern world is vastly more complex, more interconnected, and more technologically advanced than the Late Bronze Age world, and the mechanisms of modern civilization, industrial agriculture, fossil fuels, digital communications, nuclear deterrence, are fundamentally different from the mechanisms of the palace economies of the Bronze Age. But the structural parallels are real, and they are worth taking seriously, because they suggest that the vulnerability of complex, interdependent systems to cascading failure is not a feature of any particular technology or any particular historical period, but a general property of complexity itself, a property that applies to any system in which the components are tightly coupled, and in which the failure of one component can propagate through the system and trigger the failure of others. The historian Eric Klein, in his study of the Bronze Age collapse, has drawn explicit parallels between the Late Bronze Age system and the modern global system, arguing that the convergence of multiple crises that destroyed the Late Bronze Age world has echoes in the multiple crises that the modern world faces simultaneously. Climate change, which is altering weather patterns and reducing agricultural productivity in many parts of the world, parallels the drought that contributed to the collapse of the Late Bronze Age kingdoms. The disruption of global supply chains, whether by pandemic, by geopolitical conflict, or by natural disaster, parallels the disruption of the trade networks that deprived the Late Bronze Age kingdoms of essential raw materials. Political instability, populist movements, and the erosion of international norms and institutions parallel the internal tensions and the diplomatic breakdowns that weakened the Late Bronze Age states in the decades before the collapse. The parallels are not exact, and the outcome of the modern crisis is not predetermined, but the precedent of the Bronze Age collapse suggests that the convergence of multiple crises can have consequences that are far greater than the sum of their individual effects, and that the assumption that the modern world is too advanced, too resilient, or too interconnected to collapse is an assumption that the people of the Late Bronze Age would have shared and that they would have been wrong to share. The very word interconnected captures the paradox at the heart of both the ancient and the modern systems. Interconnection creates resilience under normal conditions because it allows the system to compensate for local failures by drawing on resources from other parts of the network. But interconnection also creates vulnerability under extreme conditions because it transmits the effects of local failures across the entire system, turning what might have been a local crisis into a systemic catastrophe. The question for the modern world is not whether interconnection is beneficial. It obviously is. The question is whether the modern world has developed the institutional capacity to manage the risks that interconnection creates, to contain the cascading failures that can propagate through a tightly coupled system, and to maintain the essential functions of civilization when multiple parts of the system fail simultaneously. The Bronze Age collapse raises one final question that is perhaps the most unsettling of all. The Late Bronze Age kingdoms had no concept of systemic risk, no theoretical framework for understanding how the interaction of multiple crises could produce a catastrophe that exceeded the capacity of any individual kingdom to manage. They responded to each crisis as a separate problem, deploying separate solutions: grain imports for the famine, fortifications for the military threat, diplomatic missions for the breakdown of the international order, without recognizing that the crises were interconnected and that the solutions to one crisis might exacerbate another. The modern world, by contrast, does have a theoretical understanding of systemic risk, does have analytical tools for modeling the behavior of complex systems, and does have institutional mechanisms, however imperfect, for coordinating responses to multiple simultaneous crises. The question is whether this theoretical understanding, these analytical tools, and these institutional mechanisms are sufficient to prevent the modern equivalent of the Bronze Age collapse, or whether they are merely the modern equivalent of the fortifications that the Mycenaean rulers built around their citadels in the late 13th century, reasonable responses to a recognized threat that were ultimately insufficient to prevent the catastrophe they were designed to forestall. The Bronze Age collapse also raises questions about the role of individual agency in the face of systemic crisis. The leaders of the late Bronze Age kingdoms were not passive observers of their own destruction. They took action to address the crises they faced, sending diplomatic missions, requesting military aid, importing grain, deploying armies, and building fortifications. The Hittite king wrote to the pharaoh for grain. The king of Ugarit wrote to the king of Alashia for military assistance. Ramesses III mobilized the entire military apparatus of the Egyptian state to confront the Sea Peoples in battle. These leaders were not incompetent or ignorant. They were experienced rulers who understood the threats they faced and who took reasonable measures to address them. And yet their efforts were insufficient, because the threats they faced were systemic in nature, arising not from a single identifiable cause that could be addressed by a single countermeasure, but from the interaction of multiple causes that reinforced each other in ways that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. There is a philosophical pause here, a moment when the specific facts of the Bronze Age collapse yield to a broader meditation on the nature of civilizational resilience and the limits of human agency. The leaders of the late Bronze Age kingdoms did everything that could reasonably have been expected of them. They responded to the crises they faced with the tools and the knowledge available to them. They maintained their diplomatic relationships. They mobilized their military forces. They sought allies and requested assistance. And yet the system failed because the crises they faced were beyond the capacity of any individual leader or any individual kingdom to address. The failure was not a failure of leadership. It was a failure of the system, a failure that arose from the structural properties of the system itself, from its complexity, its interdependence, and its vulnerability to cascading failure. The role of contingency in the collapse also deserves reflection. The Bronze Age collapse was not inevitable. The individual crises that contributed to it, the drought, the earthquakes, the trade disruptions, the migrations, were each contingent events that might not have occurred, or that might have occurred at different times and in different combinations. The collapse was the result of the specific convergence of these specific crises at this specific moment in history, a convergence that was unlikely but not impossible, and that, once it occurred, set in motion a cascade of failures that could not be stopped. The lesson is not that complex civilizations are doomed to collapse. It is that complex civilizations are vulnerable to the convergence of multiple crises, and that the convergence, when it occurs, can produce consequences that are out of all proportion to the individual severity of the crises themselves. The Bronze Age collapse also teaches us something about the relationship between the collapse of institutions and the survival of people. The late Bronze Age kingdoms were destroyed, but the populations of the Eastern Mediterranean were not exterminated. People survived the collapse. They lived through the dark ages that followed. They adapted to the new conditions, forming new communities, developing new technologies, creating new cultural traditions. The Iron Age civilizations that eventually emerged from the Dark Ages, the Greek city-states, the Phoenician trading empire, the Israelite kingdoms, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, were built by the descendants of the people who had survived the collapse, people who carried with them fragments of the cultural traditions of the late Bronze Age, preserved in oral tradition, in craft knowledge, in religious practice, and in the myths and legends that later generations wrote down. The collapse destroyed institutions, but it did not destroy people, and the people who survived eventually rebuilt, creating civilizations that were in some ways more resilient than the ones they replaced. Civilizations that were decentralized rather than centralized, that relied on trade and exchange rather than on palace redistribution, and that developed new technologies including iron metallurgy and the alphabetic script that made them less dependent on the long-distance supply chains and the specialized bureaucracies that had made the Bronze Age kingdoms both powerful and fragile. There is a second philosophical pause here, a moment when the narrative reaches beyond the specific facts of the Bronze Age collapse to touch on something more universal. Every civilization believes itself to be permanent. Every civilization looks at its cities, its institutions, its technologies, its military forces, and sees a structure that is too solid, too complex, too deeply rooted to be threatened by the forces that have destroyed other civilizations in the past. The people of the late Bronze Age kingdoms believed this. They lived in a world that had endured for centuries, a world in which the great powers had coexisted, the trade routes had functioned, and the diplomatic norms had been observed for as long as anyone could remember. They had no reason to believe that their world was about to end. And yet it did, within the span of a single lifetime, swept away by a combination of forces that no one had anticipated and that no one could control. The Bronze Age collapse also teaches us something important about the difference between the collapse of institutions and the survival of people. The distinction matters because it reminds us that civilizational collapse, however devastating, is not the end of human life or human creativity. The late Bronze Age kingdoms were destroyed, but the populations of the Eastern Mediterranean were not exterminated. People survived the collapse. They lived through the Dark Ages that followed. They adapted to the new conditions, forming new communities, developing new technologies, creating new cultural traditions. The Iron Age civilizations that eventually emerged from the Dark Ages, the Greek city-states, the Phoenician trading empire, the Israelite kingdoms, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, were built by the descendants of the people who had survived the collapse. People who carried with them fragments of the cultural traditions of the late Bronze Age, preserved in oral tradition, in craft knowledge, in religious practice, and in the myths and legends that later generations wrote down. The collapse destroyed institutions, but it did not destroy people, and the people who survived eventually rebuilt, creating civilizations that were in some ways more resilient than the ones they replaced. The classical civilizations were more decentralized, relying on trade and exchange rather than on palace redistribution. They developed new technologies including iron metallurgy and the alphabetic script that made them less dependent on the fragile supply chains of the Bronze Age. The collapse, for all its devastation, was also a moment of creative destruction, a clearing of the ground that allowed new forms of civilization to emerge, forms that might never have developed if the Bronze Age palace system had continued to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. The observation is not intended to minimize the suffering that the collapse caused. The suffering was immense, and the loss of knowledge, of art, of literacy, of institutional memory was irreparable. But the observation does remind us that the human capacity for recovery, for adaptation, and for creative renewal is as much a part of the story of the Bronze Age collapse as the destruction itself. The modern world would do well to reflect on this precedent. The challenges that the modern world faces, climate change, resource depletion, pandemic disease, political instability, the disruption of global supply chains, are individually manageable. No single one of these challenges, taken in isolation, is sufficient to bring down modern civilization. But the late Bronze Age collapse demonstrates that individually manageable challenges can become collectively catastrophic when they converge, when they interact with and amplify each other in ways that overwhelm the resilience of the system. The question is not whether the modern world faces threats comparable to those that destroyed the late Bronze Age kingdoms. It does. The question is whether the modern world is better prepared to withstand the convergence of multiple, simultaneous threats than the late Bronze Age kingdoms were, and the honest answer is that we do not know. And so we return to the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean, to the ruins of cities that were old when Rome was young, to the ashes of palaces that had sheltered kings who called each other brother, to the silence of harbours that had once teemed with ships carrying copper and tin and gold and glass and ivory and cedar and grain across the wine-dark sea. The cities are gone, the palaces are rubble, the harbours are empty, the kings and their brothers are dust. their names preserved only in the clay tablets that survived the fires that consumed their kingdoms. Tablets that lay buried in the earth for more than 3,000 years before the patient work of archaeologists brought them back into the light. The sea peoples came, that much we know. They came from the islands and the mainlands of the sea, as the Egyptian inscriptions tell us. A coalition of peoples whose names we can transliterate, but whose identities we cannot confirm, whose homelands we can guess at, but cannot locate with certainty, whose motivations we can speculate about, but cannot know. They came, and the world that had existed before them was destroyed, and the world that came after them was different in every meaningful way, simpler, poorer, more fragmented, more violent, a world in which the achievements of the late Bronze Age, the literacy, the trade, the diplomacy, the cultural exchange, were lost for centuries and in some cases forever. Whether the sea peoples caused the collapse or were merely swept up in it, whether they were the disease or the symptom, whether they were the agents of destruction or the refugees of a destruction that had already begun, the answer remains uncertain, and it may remain uncertain forever, because the evidence is insufficient to resolve the question definitively, and because the distinction between cause and effect, in a system as complex and as tightly coupled as the late Bronze Age world, may be ultimately meaningless. The drought caused the famine caused the unrest caused the weakness invited the attack caused the displacement caused the migration caused further destruction. Each effect became a cause, each cause produced new effects, and the cascade of failures fed on itself until there was nothing left to fail. The Medinet Habu reliefs, carved in stone by the artisans of Ramesses III more than 3,000 years ago, depict the sea peoples in their final battle with the forces of Egypt. The warriors with their feathered headdresses, their round shields, their long swords, their ox carts laden with women and children, are frozen in stone, forever caught in the moment of their defeat, their ships capsized by the Egyptian navy, their warriors falling beneath Egyptian arrows, their families captured and led away in chains. The reliefs are a victory monument, designed to celebrate the power of the pharaoh and to immortalize his triumph over the enemies of Egypt. But they are also, inadvertently, a monument to the sea peoples themselves, the only visual record of a people who left no monuments of their own, who built no temples and carved no reliefs, and wrote no inscriptions, and whose existence we know of primarily because they were defeated by the one great power that survived to record the encounter. The ruins remain. At Hattusa, in the highlands of central Turkey, the foundations of the great Hittite temples and palaces lie exposed on a windswept plateau. The walls that once enclosed a city of more than 30,000 people, reduced to courses of stone a few feet high. The carved reliefs that once decorated the city gates, weathering slowly in the Anatolian sun. At Mycenae, the Lion Gate still stands, its massive lintel carved with the image of two lions flanking a column, a symbol of the power and the confidence of a civilization that believed it would endure forever. At Ugarit, the ruins of the palace and the temples lie buried beneath the tell of Ras Shamra on the Syrian coast, silent witnesses to the last days of a city that saw its destruction coming and could do nothing to prevent it. At Pylos, the great Megaron of Nestor's palace, immortalized in the legends of Homer, lies open to the sky, its painted floors cracked by the fire that consumed it more than 3,000 years ago, its frescoes faded by millennia of sun and rain. The voices of the people who once filled its halls, silenced by the catastrophe that swept them into oblivion. The Megaron at Pylos was once one of the most magnificent rooms in the Bronze Age world, a great hall with a central hearth surrounded by 4 columns, its walls decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes of banqueting, of warfare, and of religious ceremony. The Linear B tablets found in the archive room adjacent to the Megaron recorded the last transactions of the palace administration, the distribution of bronze for weapons, the mobilization of rowers for the fleet, the assignment of watchers to the coastline, all the frantic preparations of a kingdom that knew it was about to be attacked and that could not prevent its own destruction. The tablets were preserved only because the fire that destroyed the palace also baked the clay on which they were written, transforming fragile, unfired tablets into durable ceramic records that have survived for more than 3,000 years. The destruction that ended the kingdom also preserved its last words, an irony that the people of Pylos, had they known it, might not have found comforting. The last letter of Ugarit is perhaps the most haunting artifact of the Bronze Age collapse, not because of what it says, but because of what it represents. It is a letter that was never sent, a plea for help that was never heard, a voice that was silenced in the very act of speaking. The letter was found in the kiln where it was being baked for preservation, and the fact that it was never removed from the kiln tells us that the city fell before the letter could be sent, that the end came so quickly that there was no time to complete even this most basic act of communication. The letter is a monument to the speed and the finality of the collapse, a physical reminder that the end, when it came faster than anyone had expected, faster than anyone could have prepared for, faster than anyone could have escaped. The Bronze Age collapse happened more than 3,000 years ago. The civilizations that were destroyed have been gone for more than 100 generations. The languages that the people of those civilizations spoke, Hittite, Luwian, Ugaritic, Mycenaean Greek, survive only in the clay tablets and the stone inscriptions that archaeologists have recovered from the ruins of their cities. The people themselves are gone, their names forgotten, their faces unknown, their stories untold, except for the fragments that can be reconstructed from the archaeological record and from the myths and legends that later civilizations preserved, often without understanding their origins. The Greeks of the classical period, who built the civilization that the modern world regards as the foundation of Western culture, lived in the shadow of the Bronze Age collapse without knowing it. They knew that there had been a heroic age, a time of great kings and great warriors who had fought at Troy and sailed the seas and performed deeds of valor that later generations could not match. But they did not know that the heroic age they celebrated in their myths was the memory, distorted and embellished by centuries of oral transmission, of the very civilization that the Bronze Age collapse had destroyed. They did not know that the massive stone walls of Mycenae, which they attributed to the Cyclopes, because they could not imagine how human beings could have built them, were the work of their own ancestors who had lived in a world of palaces and chariots and international trade that had been swept away by a catastrophe whose causes the Greeks themselves could not remember or explain. The irony is profound. The classical Greek civilization that we celebrate as the birthplace of Western culture, the civilization that gave us democracy and philosophy and tragedy and the Olympic Games, was built on the ruins of a more ancient civilization that was, in many ways, more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan, and more internationally connected than anything the classical Greeks themselves achieved. The Mycenaean world had international trade, diplomatic relations with the great powers of the Near East, a professional bureaucracy, monumental architecture, and literacy. The classical Greek world had to reinvent all of these things, slowly and painfully, over a period of centuries, recovering capabilities that the Greeks' own ancestors had possessed and that had been lost in the catastrophe that ended the Bronze Age. And yet the collapse is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a warning. It is a demonstration drawn from the deepest well of historical experience that complex civilizations are not permanent, that the systems of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that sustain them are not indestructible, and that the convergence of multiple crises can overwhelm even the most powerful and most sophisticated societies. The leaders of the late Bronze Age kingdoms did not know that their world was about to end. They could not have known, because the tipping point at which resilience fails and collapse begins is invisible until it has already been crossed. They lived in a world that seemed stable, prosperous, and permanent, a world in which the great powers had coexisted for centuries, in which the trade routes had functioned for generations, in which the diplomatic norms had been observed for as long as anyone could remember. And then, within the span of a single lifetime, that world was gone, replaced by silence, by darkness, by the slow growth of grass over the ruins of palaces that had once been the centres of the civilized world. The sea peoples came from the sea. We do not know where they went. We do not know who they truly were. We know only that after they came, the world was different, and that the world that came before them, with all its achievements, its beauty, its complexity, and its promise, was lost to time, buried in the earth, waiting for the distant future to discover its remains, and to wonder, as we wonder now, how something so powerful could have been so fragile, and how something so fragile could have endured so long. The rediscovery of the Late Bronze Age world by modern archaeology has been one of the great intellectual achievements of the past 2 centuries. A slow, painstaking reconstruction of a vanished civilization from the fragments that survived the collapse. The clay tablets, the stone inscriptions, the pottery sherds, the bronze tools, the crumbling foundations of palaces and temples and city walls. The work of scholars like Heinrich Schliemann, who excavated Troy and Mycenae in the 19th century, Arthur Evans, who discovered the Minoan civilization on Crete, Hugo Winkler, who rediscovered the Hittite Empire at Hattusa, Claude Schaefer, who excavated Ugarit, Carl Blegen, who excavated the palace at Pylos, and George Bass, who pioneered the underwater archaeology that recovered the Uluburun wreck, has assembled a picture of the late Bronze Age world that is detailed, complex, and profoundly illuminating. A picture that reveals a civilization of remarkable sophistication, remarkable interconnection, and remarkable fragility. The picture is still incomplete. There are vast gaps in the evidence, entire regions and entire centuries for which the archaeological record is sparse or non-existent. The identity of the Sea Peoples remains uncertain. The precise causes of the collapse remain debated. The relative importance of drought, earthquakes, trade disruption, internal revolt, and external invasion remains a matter of scholarly contention. The Bronze Age collapse is one of those historical events that becomes more mysterious the more we learn about it, because each new piece of evidence reveals new complexities and raises new questions that the existing evidence cannot answer. The mystery is not a failure of scholarship. It is a consequence of the depth and the complexity of the event itself. An event that involved multiple causes, multiple actors, multiple regions, and multiple time frames, and that cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of cause and effect. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. The world is more complex than our narratives allow. The causes of great events are more numerous, more interconnected, and more resistant to simple explanation than our theories can accommodate. The Sea Peoples may have caused the collapse. They may have been caused by the collapse. They may have been both cause and effect, agents and victims, destroyers and refugees, all at the same time. The categories that we use to organize our understanding of the past, invader and defender, cause and effect, agent and patient, may be inadequate to capture the reality of an event in which everything happened at once, and in which every effect was also a cause, and every cause was also an effect. The Bronze Age collapse is a warning, not only about the fragility of civilization, but about the limitations of understanding, a reminder that the past is not a simple story with clear heroes and clear villains, but a tangled, contradictory, irreducibly complex web of causes and consequences that the human mind can approach, but never fully comprehend. The Sea Peoples remain at the center of the mystery, elusive, undefined, their identities unconfirmed, their homelands unknown, their role in the collapse still debated after more than a century of scholarship. They are the ghosts that haunt the ruins of the Bronze Age world, present in the inscriptions and the reliefs of Medinet Habu, present in the feathered headdresses and the ox carts and the capsized ships carved in stone by the artisans of Rameses III, present in the Aegean pottery and the pork bones and the Aegean DNA found at Ashkelon and Ekron and Gath, present in the desperate letters of the kings of Ugarit and Al-Ashir, and yet absent from the historical record in any form that would allow us to see them as they saw themselves, to hear their voices, to know their names, to understand their motives. They are known to us only through the records of their enemies and their victims, and the picture that those records provide is incomplete, distorted, and ultimately inadequate to answer the questions that we most want to ask. The silence of the Sea Peoples is the silence of the defeated, the voiceless, the forgotten, the peoples who left no inscriptions, no monuments, no records of their own, and whose story can be reconstructed only from the traces they left in the ruins of the civilizations they destroyed. That silence is final, and no amount of archaeological ingenuity can fully overcome it. We are left with the ruins, the tablets, the reliefs, and the questions. The endlessly fascinating, endlessly frustrating questions about who the Sea Peoples were, where they came from, what drove them to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, and what became of them after the fires went out and the dust settled and the world began, slowly and painfully, to rebuild itself from the ashes of the Bronze Age. The questions will remain, the silence will endure, and the ruins will continue to crumble beneath the Mediterranean sun. Monuments to a world that was powerful, interconnected, sophisticated, magnificent, and, in the end, as terrifyingly fragile as the unfired, still damp clay of the last desperate letter of Ugarit.